We're now going to hear from Allan, the Director, U.S. Relations, United Nations World Food Program, and we are grateful that you are here, and we're also grateful that no bells have rung yet for votes. So, please feel free to be brief if you want, and again, appreciate all the work the UN World Food Program does, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Congressman, members of Congress, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to brief the Commission today on the United Nations perspective on the humanitarian situation in the Horn of Africa. And let me add my voice to those who have expressed condolences and admiration for the work of Congressman Payne. I mean, his work in Africa, for all of us who've dealt with the humanitarian and foreign policy aspects of Africa, is long-lasting and admirable, and will be deeply remembered and appreciated by those of us who work there, and more importantly, by the people of Africa themselves. The Horn of Africa is one of the most serious situations in the world today, affecting over 10 million people. As other speakers have said, the strong international response to this crisis over the past 9 months has had a significant positive effect, saving lives and improving health and nutritional status. But the international community nonetheless needs to remain vigilant in light of potential challenges in the months ahead that could slow or even reverse the progress achieved to date. My written statement will have more details on the current situation, but in light of the comments of many others, I'll be rather brief on the sort of situational update. I think it's encouraging that so many of the speakers already, and my own reported from the UN side, show such a commonality of views. I think that's already an encouraging side for coordination. As people have said, all the countries in the region have faced a severe drought that had its most severe impact in the middle part of 2011. The drought has been further exacerbated by conflict and governance challenges in Somalia. Long-awaited rains and a good harvest have brought relief to some drought-affected areas of the Horn, but millions still need food assistance. Since the beginning of July 2011, when famine was declared, the World Food Program has reached over 9 million people in the Horn of Africa with direct assistance. In Somalia, WFP is assisting 1.3 million people. It is providing food and nutritional support to 556,000 refugees in Kenya and 298,000 refugees in Ethiopia. And finally, WFP is also assisting 5.7 million drought-affected people in Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, and Uganda, down from the peak of over 7 million in the heart of the crisis earlier this year, or late 2011. WFP food assistance is providing the nutritional support that communities need to rebuild their lives and build resilience against future droughts. We've heard a lot about nutrition from previous speakers. WFP has increased the number of nutrition programs for both refugees and drought-affected people, using specialized products to both prevent and treat malnutrition, especially in children, pregnant women, and nursing mothers. Longer-term programs supporting communities to build sustainable food security are an equally crucial part of our work in Ethiopia and Kenya. Our Merit program, a joint effort with the government of Ethiopia, improves livelihoods by enabling chronically food insecure communities to generate income through environmental rehabilitation activities. As others have said, the situation in Somalia poses special challenges among the Horn. It is one of the most dangerous places to work. The mortality and malnutrition rates are among the highest in the world, particularly in southern Somalia, and humanitarian access in the south has deteriorated considerably in recent months. WFP is focusing its efforts on distributing food to as many people as it can reach in areas in Somalia where we have access. Currently, we have access to Puntland in the north, and in the central north, Somaliland in the north, the central regions, Mogadishu, and some border areas of the south. We have also coordinated closely with other non-governmental and international organizations which have in the past been able to deliver food and nutritional assistance to areas where WFP has not had access. Even though, as many have already said, famine is no longer present in Somalia, 2.3 million people remain in crisis, unable to fully meet their essential food and non-food needs. There are two factors that raise concern that the improvements in the food security in Somalia could be jeopardized in the month ahead. First, there's uncertainty about the rainfall in the Horn generally and Somalia specifically. The seasonal forecasts from institutions such as the Intergovernmental Authority on Development suggest an increased probability of below-average rainfall in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, and most of Somalia during the March to May 2012 season. As a result, large numbers of people are likely to remain in crisis until the August 2012 seasonal harvest. A second factor of concern, as I said, is reduced humanitarian access to southern Somalia. The pullout of the International Committee of the Red Cross from southern Somalia in January and the expulsion of 16 humanitarian groups by armed elements in southern Somalia in November will leave approximately 1.7 million people without access to food assistance. WFP is very concerned about the well-being of people in areas beyond the reach of international humanitarian aid. I would also like to call attention to the situation in South Sudan, which hasn't been mentioned much, a country that's not always considered part of the Horn of Africa, but suffers from some of the same factors that have produced widespread food insecurity in the rest of the Horn. South Sudan faces a cereal deficit of 470,000 metric tons, half of its national requirement and 60% more than last year's deficit. Delayed and erratic rains, as well as political instability and conflict, are major factors leading to this food deficit. It is estimated that as many as 4.7 million people could suffer from food insecurity in southern Sudan in 2012, with an estimated 1 million people severely food insecure. South Sudan also currently hosts more than 100,000 refugees, with more expected to arrive from the Republic of Sudan as the humanitarian situation in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile continue to deteriorate. And I want to commend Congressman McGovern for his speech recently on the floor of the House, calling attention to the serious situation in South Kordofan and Blue Nile and its implications for the humanitarian situation in the Horn. Let me conclude my remarks by going over what I see as the three main positive achievements of the international assistance effort to the Horn and the three greatest challenges we face in the months ahead. And I think it's interesting that in these challenges, they are quite similar to what was identified by previous speakers. The first of the positive achievements, as many have already said, is that famine is no longer present in the Horn of Africa. And it is significant that Somalia had famine appear in July of 2011, but had been declared no longer present as of February 3rd of this year through significant international assistance and somewhat better rain. But as others have said, perhaps even more significant is that famine conditions never appeared elsewhere in the Horn, despite drought conditions in much of Ethiopia, of Kenya, as least as severe as in Somalia. Long-term programs such as the Productive Safety Nets and WFP's Merit Program reduced the number of people needing emergency food assistance in Ethiopia. And the willingness of the governments of Kenya and Ethiopia to permit humanitarian access to drought-affected populations allowed international food assistance to be scaled up rapidly, preventing serious food insecurity from reaching famine levels. Secondly, the UN and NGO community has come together to address collectively the enormous challenges in responding to the crisis in the Horn. Joint food assessments through coordinated UN and U.S. institutions in the Horn of Africa represent one of the best examples of coordinated food security analysis we've seen in a long time in addressing a major emergency, and I think it has been significant throughout this crisis that the assessment information has been consistent across the board, quite detailed, and shared by a wide variety of stakeholders. The Somalia Food Assistance Cluster, led by WFP, has brought together all the NGOs and international organizations working in Somalia. The cluster has enhanced coordination and information sharing in order to maximize opportunities to deliver vital assistance to southern Somalia within an environment where an international humanitarian access is extremely limited. And close cooperation between the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the World Food Program, and NGOs assisting refugees have proved essential in meeting the challenges posed by a rapid increase in Somali refugee populations in Ethiopia and Kenya. And the third positive is that the international community, led by the United States, has responded generously by contributing significant resources to the humanitarian assistance community's needs in the Horn of Africa. WFP, for example, has received $800 million in contributions from more than 40 donors since famine was declared in Somalia in July 2011, although it does still require an additional $81 million through July 2012 to ensure that the needs of food assistance are met in the Horn. But the three challenges as I conclude, the most important is that millions of people still need food assistance and the rains are uncertain. Food security outcomes will depend heavily on the performance of the March to May 2012 rains, and there is a real possibility that drought conditions could worsen in the next several months. The second major challenge is that limited humanitarian access to southern Somalia I mentioned, leaving 1.7 million people without access, and while the harvest is of good now, as we hit that lean season in the late spring, that lack of access could be crucial to the people and could lead to new crisis. And the third challenge is to make sure that the international community supports programs for resiliency and recovery in the Horn as robustly as it has supported emergency relief programs over the next 9 months. As the situation in Ethiopia shows, long-term investments in agricultural community development and disaster preparedness can reduce the need for emergency assistance when drought hits the region. The next crisis in the Horn can have a less severe impact if the international community stays engaged in the region and supports the long-term investments needed to reduce chronic hunger and increase capacity to cope with future shocks. Thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to responding to any of your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jury, and you know, I've known you for a long time, and I'm a big fan of WFP, and you know, I'm in this. Well, I'm not going to ask any questions. I want to get Mr. Yarnell in before we have to adjourn this hearing. But I do just want to say that I think it is kind of refreshing that everybody seems to be reading off the same sheet of music, and that's encouraging. You know, we need to provide the resources, and we need to challenge the world to provide the resources. But I just want to just conclude by saying that I not only appreciate the work that you do and what WFP does, I'm really grateful to the people in the field because I've seen what they do up close and personal, and it is oftentimes at great risk to themselves. And so I thank you for that, and I will not have any questions right now. I don't know whether.
I do know we have to leave. I just have one question. I'm trying to reconcile the fact that we spent in the last fiscal year 2/3 of our humanitarian assistance went to emergency food assistance, and then this last fiscal year it was closer to about 80%. With your statement about the movement from emergency assistance to other kind of sustained assistance over the long term. Am I misunderstanding that?
Well, a lot of the longer-term assistance that I think we're talking about doesn't necessarily have to involve direct distribution of food. A lot of it is cash and development programs of the type that Ms. Lindbergh talked earlier about in Feed the Future. And I really do think that has been one of the achievements of the administration over the last several years, is we're not trying to use food aid for everything. Food aid is really critical in emergencies, and in certain select circumstances it can be the right tool in development. But having the full toolbox of assistance, of cash, of vouchers, of long-term agricultural development really gives us a much better opportunity than a world in which we try to deal with hunger only with food aid. And I say this even as an organization which makes it its core food aid. We've tried to broaden our toolbox ourselves to address hunger in multiple ways, and I think the administration's move in that direction so that when we look at the long term, we should be looking at Feed the Future and the development assistance accounts and how they integrate, and how we can think about the transition even in food aid more explicitly, because too often we end up with a situation where there's one pot for development, one pot for emergencies, and people aren't thinking enough about the transitional time that kind of falls between the gaps. And I think, Congressman earlier said, what more can we do? I think continuing to focus and work, and I'm sure there are ideas from NGOs and others about how to deal with this, on how we can resource that transition is a critical need. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I mean, I do think that the third challenge this is why the third challenge that you laid out is probably the more complicated one to figure out in this body. But thank you very much.
And just before we go, let me also also thank WFP, you in particular, Josette Sharon, and others, Friends of the World Food Program as well, for at very key moments in terms of what we were going to do in terms of funding and stepping up to the crisis to deal with what was happening in the Horn of Africa. WFP was very persuasive, and I will urge you to continue to do that. This is a place that constantly needs to be persuaded, even on these kinds of issues. And I think that while it's not as much funding and not as resources going as I would like, I know it would be a lot less without WFP's leadership here in the United States and around the world. So please thank everybody for us.
Thank you, and I can assure you, you have my continued commitment to continue to work at those levels.
Good. Thank you very much.